about the man. He hadn't thought of it when he saw him before, but here, on the heels of the presentation to the Merritt Metro Police Department, it seemed obvious. No photos existed of Mitchell Turner, Victor's partner in crime, but there had been generic thug descriptions: tall, burly, bald, tattooed. Dozens of men would fit the bill, but how many of them would cross Eli's path twice in as many days? Eli had long since abandoned the notion of coincidence. If this man was Turner, then Victor couldn't be far away. He scanned the bar, searching for Victor's blonde hair, his sharp smile, but he didn't see anyone who fit the bill, and by the time he turned his attention back to the counter, Mitchell was talking to Dominic Rusher. His hulking form leaned in over the ex-soldier like a shadow, and while the noise in the bar drowned out the conversation itself, Eli could see his lips moving quickly, could see Dominic stiffen in response. And then, mere moments after he sat down, Mitchell stood back up. Without ordering, without another word. Eli watched him scan the bar, watched the man's eyes pass blankly over him and settle on the sign that read, "Restrooms," in neon yellow light. Mitchell Turner made his way, stepping between Dominic and the rest of the room, his massive form for a moment, a blink, hiding the man from view. By the time he'd finished the stride, crossed from one side of the ex-soldier to the other, Dominic was gone. And Eli was on his feet. The bar stool that had, for the better part of an hour, held his target was now suddenly empty, and there was no sign to any side of Dominic Rusher. Not possible, Eli's brain might have thought. Only Eli knew it was entirely possible. It was too possible. Where the man went took a back seat in Eli's thoughts to the question of why he went, and that was a question with only one answer. He'd been spooked. Warned. Eli's gaze swiveled across the room until he saw the door to the men's room swing shut behind Mitchell Turner. He dropped a bill on the table beside his empty glass, and followed. Chapter 27. 90 minutes until midnight. The Esquire Hotel. Sydney perched on the desk chair, arms wrapped around her knees, attention flicking between the clock on the wall, the clock on the computer — the wall clock was a full 90 seconds faster — and the post button glowing green in the open program on Mitch's screen. Just above the button was the profile they'd constructed. Victor Vale was typed across the top, with Eli listed as his middle name. Where his date of birth should be, the current date was written. The spaces reserved for last known whereabouts were filled with the address of the Falcon Price High-Rise Project. Every other space, those reserved for background information, history, police notation, was filled with one word, repeated in every slot: midnight. To the left of the profile was the photo, or the place where the photo would have been. Instead, the bold lettering of the book spine ran vertically, reading Vale. The book they'd used for the picture, the one Victor had bought on their walk the day before, sat beneath the stack of papers Sydney was supposed to start burning soon, the blue lighter a spot of color resting on top. She slid the massive text out from under the folders and ran a thumb over the book's cover. She'd seen it before, or one just like it. Her parents had a set in their study, spines uncracked, of course. Sydney opened the book and turned to the first page, but it was a wall of black. Flipping through, she saw that every one of the first 33 pages had been systematically blacked out. The Sharpie nesting into the fold between pages 33 and 34 suggested that the only reason the remaining pages had been spared was because Victor hadn't gotten to them yet. It was only while flipping back through those 33 pages toward the front of the book that Sydney noticed two words exempt from the blackout: for and ever. The words were several pages apart, separated and surrounded by a sea of black. Not only that, but the word ever had been altered, part of a larger word, the for preceding it blotted carefully out, which meant Victor was not trying to piece together the word forever from the text. He clearly wanted it to be two separate words, distinct. For. Ever. She ran her fingers over the page, expected them to come away stained, but they didn't. Dahl whined faintly beneath the desk chair, where he'd somehow crammed himself, or at least a good part of his front half, and Sydney shut the book and looked back at the clock. It was after 10:30 according to both the wall and the computer. Her index finger hovered over the screen. She knew what it would mean to hit the button. Even without knowing Victor's plan, She knew that if she clicked post, there would be no going back, and Eli would find Victor, and at least one of them would die, and tomorrow, everything would be horrible again. She would be alone. One way or another. Alone. An EO with a wounded arm and a sister who wanted her dead, with a sick, strange gift and absent parents. And maybe she would be running, or maybe she would be killed too. None of it sounded terribly appealing. She considered not posting it. She could pretend the computer had crashed, could steal them another day. Why did Victor have to do this? Why did he and Eli have to find each other? But even as she asked it, she knew the answer. She knew because her own pulse still quickened defiantly as she thought of Serena. Because even as reason told her to run as far from her sister as possible, the gravity of want drew Sydney back. She couldn't break the orbit. But she could keep from falling. Couldn't Victor, just for a little while? Couldn't they all stay aloft? Alive? But then Mitch's warning echoed in her head. There are no good men in this game. And when she closed her eyes to block it out, she saw Victor Vale. Not as he was in the rain that first day, or even as he was when she accidentally woke him, but as he was this afternoon, standing over that cop's body, pain crackling in the air around him as he ordered her to bring the dead man back. Sydney opened her eyes and hit the post button. Chapter 28. 75 minutes until midnight. The Three Crows Bar. Victor was leaning back against the cold brick side of the bar's alley wall, consulting Dominic Rush's profile, when a man matching the photo staggered out of nothing and into the narrow run between the buildings. Victor was impressed, especially considering the door to the bar had never opened, but did his best to hide it in the interest of maintaining the upper hand. Dominic, for his part, took one look at Victor. He had a black eye and a blue one, and according to his file, the blue was fake, then staggered forward in pain, clutching his side and crumpled, one knee cracking against the concrete. It wasn't Victor's doing. The man was in bad shape, and whatever disappearing stunt he'd pulled with the shadows hadn't helped his condition. "You know, Mr. Rusher," said Victor, closing the folder, "you really shouldn't be mixing methahydrocone with alcohol, and if you're this bad on 35 milligrams, a drink's not going to help." "Who are you?" gasped Dominic. "Where's my friend?" asked Victor. "The one who warned you." "Still in there. He just said there was a man—" "I know what he said. I told him to say it. There's a man who wants to kill you." "But why?" Victor didn't enjoy persuasion nearly as much as coercion. It took so much longer. "Because you're an EO," he said. "Because you're unnatural. Something to that extent. And I should clarify, the man doesn't just want to kill you. He will kill you." Dominic struggled to his feet and met Victor's gaze. "Like I'm afraid to die?" There was a stubborn intensity in his eyes. "Well," said Victor, "how hard can it be, right? You've done it once. But being afraid and being unwilling are different things. I don't think you want to die." "How do you know?" he growled. Victor dropped the profile on top of a trash can. "Because you would have done it. You're a mess. You're in constant pain. Every moment of the day, I'm guessing. But you don't end it, which speaks either to your resilience or your stupidity, but also to your wish to live. And because you came here." He gestured to the alley. "Mitch told you to come here if you wanted to live. You could have left and taken your chances, though how far you'd get given your condition, who knows. The point is, you didn't leave. You came here. So while I have no doubt you would face death again with all the honor of a soldier, I don't think you're eager to." Even as he spoke, he was picturing the game board, pieces shifting to accommodate a talent he'd only glimpsed, but already knew he wanted. "I'm giving you a choice," he added. "Go back inside and wait to die, or go home and wait to die, or stay with me and live." "Why do you care?" "I don't," said Victor simply. "Not about you, that is. But the one who wants to kill you? I want him dead, and you can help me." "Why would I?" Victor sighed. "Aside from the obvious self-preservation," he held out his empty hand, palm up, and smiled, "I'll make it worth your while." When Dominic didn't take his hand, Victor brought it to rest on the man's shoulder. He could both feel and see as the pain left Dominic's body, watch it slide from his limbs and his jaw and his forehead and his eyes, which then widened in shock. What did you— My name, Mr. Usher, is Victor Vale. I am an EO, and I can take away your pain, all of it, forever. Or— His hand slid from the young man's shoulder, and a moment later Dominic's face crumpled as the pain swept back, redoubled. I can give it back, and leave you here to live in agony, or die at a stranger's hands. Not the best death for a soldier. No, hissed Dominic through gritted teeth. Please, what do I have to do? Victor smiled. 1 night's worth of work for a lifetime without pain. What are you willing to do? When Dominic didn't answer, Victor clicked the dial up in his mind, watched the man wince, buckle. Anything, Dominic gasped at last. Anything! Mitch stood at the bathroom sink, pushing the sleeves of his coat up to wash his hands. He turned the faucet on and heard the door open over the sound of the water. His form filled the mirror edge to edge, so he couldn't see the man behind him, but he didn't need to. He could hear Eli Ever cross the threshold and slide the bolt on the bathroom door, locking the world out, locking them in. What did you tell him? Came Eli's voice behind him. Mitch turned off the water but stayed at the sink. Tell who? The man at the bar. You were talking to him and then he disappeared. The paper towels were out of reach, and Mitch knew better than to make any sudden movements, so he wiped his hands on his coat and turned to face the other man. It's a bar, he said with a shrug. People come and go. No, Eli snapped. He literally disappeared, vanished. Mitch forced a laugh. Look, man, he said, walking past Eli toward the door as if he didn't notice the thrown bolt. I think you've had a few too many. He heard Eli draw the gun from his coat, and his words cut off as his steps slowed, then stopped. Eli cocked the weapon. Mitch could tell it was an automatic by the metallic grating on the top half as it was shifted back and primed. He turned slowly toward the sound. The gun was in Eli's hand, the silencer already screwed on, but instead of being trained on Mitch, it hung at Eli's side, and that made Mitch more nervous. The casual way he held the weapon, fingers barely gripping it, not only comfortable with the gun, but in control. He looked like he felt in control. I've seen you before, said Eli, at the Esquire downtown. Mitch cocked his head and tugged one corner of his mouth up. Do I look like I'd be caught in a place like that? No, which is exactly why I noticed you. Mitch's smile faded. Eli raised the gun and took him in over the sight. Someone swiped the visuals from the prison files and the police logs, but I'm willing to bet your name is Mitchell Turner. Now where's Victor? Mitch thought to feign ignorance, but in the end, he decided not to chance it. He'd never been that great at telling lies anyway, and he knew he'd have to make the few he needed count. You must be Eli, he said. Victor told me about you, said you had a thing for killing innocent people. They're not innocent, growled Eli. Where is Victor? Haven't seen him since we reached the city and split ways. I don't believe that. I don't care. Eli swallowed, fingers drifting toward the trigger. And Dominic Rusher? Mitch shrugged, but slid a step back. Kid just vanished. Eli took a step forward, settled his finger against the trigger. What did you tell him? A smile twitched at the corner of Mitch's mouth. I told him to run. Eli's eyes narrowed. He twirled the gun in his hand, the barrel fetching up against his palm, and swung the handle hard against Mitch's head. His face cracked sideways and blood poured from the gash above his eye, running into his vision as Eli brought his boot up, hard, and sent him sprawling backward to the bathroom floor. Eli spun the gun again and trained it on Mitch's chest. Where is Victor? He demanded. Mitch squinted through the blood. You'll see him soon enough, he said. It's almost midnight. Eli bared his teeth and bowed his head, and Mitch thought he could see him mouth the words, Forgive me, before he looked up, and pulled the trigger. Victor checked his watch. It was almost 11 p.m., and Mitch still hadn't come out. Dominic stood nearby, stretching, rolling his head and shoulders and swinging his arms forward and backward and side to side, as if he'd just set down a heavy burden. Victor supposed that in many ways he had. After all, Victor knew pain enough to know how much Dominic had been in, and was frankly impressed by the man's threshold. But while he might be able to function in pain, his powers clearly didn't flourish under it. So Victor had taken it away, taken it all away. He had, however, left as much sensation as possible, which is tricky, given how tightly the two things are intertwined. But he didn't need his newest asset accidentally bleeding out just because he didn't notice he'd cut himself. Victor's attention flicked between his watch and the ex-soldier, who was busy examining himself. People took their bodies and their health for granted, but Dominic Rusher seemed to savor every painless flexing of his hands, every stride. He clearly understood what a gift he'd been given. Good, thought Victor. Dominic, he said, what I've done can be undone, and for the record, I do not need to touch you to do it. That was for effect. Do you understand? What I've taken can be given back in a blink, from a city away or a world away. So do not cross me. Dominic nodded solemnly. In truth, Victor could only influence a person's pain threshold if they were within eyesight. The farthest he'd gotten in prison was dropping a man from across the football field-sized yard, with only a finger gun. Once he'd managed to crumple an inmate at the other end of a cell block, only his hand visible through the bars. But still, out of sight, and his accuracy quickly vanished. Not that Dominic needed to know any of that. Your power, asked Victor. How does it work? I don't exactly know how to explain. Dominic looked down at his hands and flexed and stretched them as if working out a lingering stiffness. Yea, though I walk in the shadow of the valley of death. Biblical allusions aside, please. After the mind blew, it was bad. I couldn't... It was inhuman, that pain. It was animal and everywhere. And I didn't want to die. God, I didn't, but I wanted quiet and dark, and it's hard to explain. He didn't have to. Victor knew. I felt torn apart. I was, anyway. They brought me back, but they couldn't seem to pull me through, not all the way. I spent weeks in a coma. All that time, I could feel the world, I could hear it. Swore I could see it, too, but it was like everything was far away, murky. And I couldn't reach out, couldn't touch any of it. And then I woke up, and everything was so sharp and bright and full of pain again. And all I wanted was to find that place, that dull, quiet place. And then I did. I call it walking in shadows, because I don't know any other term. I step into the darkness and can move from one place to another without being seen, without time passing, without anything. It looks like teleporting, I guess, but I have to physically move. I could cross a city in the time it takes you to blink, but it would take me hours. I'd have to walk the whole way. And it's hard, like walking through water. The world resists when you break its rules. Can you take others with you? Dominic shrugged. I've never tried. Well then, said Victor, taking hold of Dominic's arm, ignoring the moment when the man winced intrinsically away. Consider this your audition. Where are we going? My friend is still inside, said Victor, nodding toward the bar. He should have come out after you, but he didn't. That big guy? He said he'd cover me. Victor frowned. From who? The one who wants to kill me, said Dominic, frowning. I tried to tell you that guy sat down next to me and said that there was a man who wanted to kill me and that he was in the bar. Victor's grip tightened on Dominic's sleeve. Eli, take me inside, now. Dominic took a steadying breath and put his hand over Victor's. Don't know if this is even going to... The rest of the words dropped away, not fading out but plummeting into silence as the air around them shuddered and split to allow the two men through. The moment Dominic and Victor stepped through the seam, everything hushed and darkened and stilled. Victor could see the man whose arm he was touching, just as he could see the alley around them, but all of it was cast in a kind of shadow, less like night and more like the world had been photographed in black and white, and then the photo had aged, worn, grayed. Then they walked. The world rippled thickly around them, the air viscous. It pressed in on them, weighed them down. When they reached the door to the bar, it resisted Dominic's pull before finally, slowly, giving way. Inside, The photo world continued. People caught mid-drink, mid-pool shot, mid-kiss, mid-fight, and mid a dozen other things, all stuck between one breath and the next. And all the sound caught, too, so that the space filled with a horrible, heavy quiet. Victor kept his hand on Dominic's arm like a blind man, but he couldn't take his eyes from the room. He scanned, searching the frozen faces of the crowd. And then he saw him. Victor ground to a halt, jarring Dominic backward. He glanced over his shoulder and asked what was wrong, the words mouthed but never formed. And it didn't matter anyway, because Victor didn't see his lips move. He didn't see anything but the dark-haired man caught mid-stride as he wove through the crowd, away from them and toward the front door, hand reaching out for the handle. Victor wondered how he could know that man without seeing his face. It was the posture, the broad shoulders and the arrogant way he held them, the edge of his sharp jaw visible as he turned away. Eli. Victor's hand began to slip from Dominic's arm. Eli Ever was right there, half a room away, his back turned, his attention derailed and his body caught between seconds. Victor could do it. The bar was packed, but if he dropped every person at once, he'd have a shot. No. It took every ounce of focus for Victor to hold on to Dominic's sleeve. He had waited so long. He wasn't going to forfeit the planning, the lead, the control. It wouldn't work, not here, not the way it had to work. He dragged his eyes from Eli's back and forced himself to search the rest of the room, but there was no sign of Mitch. His gaze swept through and finally settled on the restrooms. A sign hung from the men's room, "Out of order," in bold letters, a hand-drawn set of lines beneath to emphasize the point. He urged Dominic forward through the heavy air until they reached the door and went in. Mitchell Turner was sprawled on the linoleum, his face stuck to the floor by a small puddle of blood emanating from a gash on his temple. Victor let go of Dominic's arm and winced as the room crashed into life all around him at once, a wave of color and noise and time. Dominic himself appeared a moment later, arms crossed, looking down at the body. "Big guy," he said quietly. Victor knelt carefully beside Mitch and reconsidered his decision to leave Sydney at the hotel. "Is he—" started Dominic as Victor reached out and brought his fingertips to the gunshot hole in Mitch's jacket. His hand came away dry. He let out a breath and patted Mitch's jaw. The man groaned. "Motherfucker!" "I see you met Eli," said Victor. "He's always been a bit trigger-happy." Mitch grunted as he sat up and touched his head, a bruise already blossoming beneath the drying blood. His gaze went to Dominic. "I see you're still alive, then. Good choice." He tried to stand and got to one knee before pausing for breath. "A little help?" he said, wincing. Victor's lips twitched, and the air hummed faintly for a moment before vanishing, taking Mitch's pain with it. The man got to his feet, swayed, and caught himself against the wall with a bloody hand, before making his way to the strip of sinks to clean up. "So, he's like bulletproof?" asked Dominic. Mitch laughed and then pulled his jacket aside to reveal the vest beneath. "Close enough," he said. "I'm not an EO, though, if that's what you're asking." Victor wet a handful of paper towels and did his best to clean Mitch's blood off the floor and the wall, while Mitch finished cleaning it off his face. "What time is it?" asked Victor, tossing the ruined towels in the bin. Dominic checked his watch. 11, why?" Mitch snapped the faucet off. "Cutting it pretty close, Vic." But Victor only smiled. "Dominic," he said, "let's show Mitch what you can do." Chapter 29. 60 minutes until midnight, the Esquire Hotel. Serena toweled off her hair, holding strands up to the bathroom light to make sure Zachary Flinch hadn't stained. She'd had to shower 3 times to get the feel of brain and blood off her skin, and even now, raw from scrubbing, with her hair probably damaged from the rinse repeat of it all, she didn't feel clean. Clean was clearly not skin deep when it came to killing. It was only the second execution she'd ever been to. The first had been Sydney's. Serena cringed at the thought of it. Maybe that's why she wanted to go, to wash the memory of her sister's almost murder from her mind, replace it with some fresher horror, as if one scene could paint over the other. Or maybe she'd asked to go along because she knew Eli would hate it. She knew how much his removals mattered to him, how much they belonged to him, and that he'd resist. Sometimes those moments when he fought back, when she could see the spark of defiance, were the only ones that made her feel alive. She hated living in such a limp world. Every glazed eye and simple nod a reminder that nothing mattered. She would start to let go, and then Eli would fight back and force her to tighten her grip. She wondered with a thrill if maybe one day he would even break free. Finally satisfied that the blood didn't stain, she dried her hair, pulled on a robe, and made her way into the living room, tapping the computer awake. She logged onto the police database and filled out the middle name window of the search form with Eli, expecting it to return with no results, since Eli should have dispatched Dominic by now. But the search came back with 2 profiles. The first belonged to Dominic, but the second belonged to Victor. She read the profile 3 times, chewing her lip, then searched the room for her phone, which she'd lobbed onto the bed when she got in. She found it beneath a pile of clothes and towels, and was halfway through punching in Eli's number when she stopped. Less than an hour until midnight. It was a trap. Eli would know it too, of course, but he would go anyway. Why wouldn't he? Whatever Eli's enemy was planning, there was only one way this night would end, and that was with Victor Vale in a body bag. And Sydney. Serena's chest tightened. Her resolve had faltered for the first time. She didn't know she had the strength to watch Eli try again, even if it wasn't really her sister, just a shadow of the little girl who'd clung to her side for 12 years, an imposter in her sister's shape. Even then. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She could drag the file to the trash. Eli wouldn't find it in time. But it would only be a stay of execution. Victor wanted to find Eli, and Eli wanted to find Victor, and one way or another they would succeed. She looked at Victor's profile one last time and tried to picture the man who had once been Eli's friend, who had brought him back, made him what he was, saved her sister. And for a moment, as she finished dialing Eli's number, she almost wished he stood a fighting chance. Chapter 30. 50 minutes until midnight, the Three Crows bar. Eli stormed through the front door of the Three Crows as he dialed Detective Stell and told him to send a cop over to the bar to clean up an incident. "It was an EO, right?" asked Stell, and the question, as well as the shade of doubt that lined the officer's voice as he asked it, troubled Eli immensely. But he didn't have time to deal with the detective's resistance, not right now, not as the clock ticked down. "Of course it was," he snapped, and hung up. Eli paused beneath the metal sculpted crows on the bar's marquee, ran his fingers through his hair, and scoured the street for any sign of Dominic Rusher or Victor Vale. But all he saw were drunkards and bums, and cars whizzing past too fast to see drivers or passengers. He swore and kicked the nearest trash can as hard as possible, relishing the blossom of pain even as it faded, whatever damage he'd done repairing, bone and tissue and skin knitting neatly back together. He shouldn't have killed Mitch Turner. He knew that, but it wasn't as though the man were innocent, not truly. Eli had seen the police records. Turner had sinned, and those who ally themselves with monsters are little better than monsters themselves. Still, he had felt no silence, no moment of peace, following the act, and Eli's chest tightened at being denied the calm, the assurance that he had not strayed. Eli bowed his head and crossed himself. His nerves were just beginning to smooth when his phone rang. "What?" he snapped into the cell, heading for his car in the lot across the street.
"Victor posted to the database,"
said Serena.
"That Falcon Price site, ground floor."
He heard the sound of the glass patio door sliding open.
"It's right here, across from the hotel. Did you take care of Dominic Rusher?"
"No," he growled. "But Mitchell Turner's dead. Is the deadline still midnight?" His anger was cooling as he walked, focus knitting him closed, the way his body knit together his skin. Things were on schedule. Not his schedule, but a schedule.
"Still midnight,"
said Serena.
"What about the police? Should I call Stell? Have him send his men over to the high-rise?"
Eli wrapped his fingers on his car and thought of Stell's question, his tone. "No. Not before midnight. Turner's dead, and Victor's mine. Tell them to be there at 12, no sooner, and order them to stay outside the walls until we're done. Tell them it's not safe." He got inside, his breath fogging the windows. "I'm on my way. Should I pick you up?" She didn't answer. "Serena." After another long pause, she finally said, No, I'm not dressed yet. I'll meet you there." Serena hung up. She was leaning on the balcony, and she barely noticed the biting chill from the iron rail under her elbows because she was too busy looking at a trail of smoke. 2 floors down and several rooms over, the smoke curled through a pair of open doors, wafting up toward her. It smelled like burning paper. Serena knew because in high school she and her friends would always light a bonfire on the first night of summer vacation and pitch their essays and exams in, casting the old year into the flames. But nice as the Esquire rooms were, none of them had fireplaces. She was still wondering about the smoke when a large black dog wandered out onto the balcony. It stared out through the bars of the railing for a moment, before a girl's voice called it back. "Doll," called the girl. "Doll, come back in." A shiver ran through Serena. She knew that voice. A moment later, the small blonde girl, who so many people had mistaken for Serena's twin, bobbed onto the porch and tugged at the dog's neck. "Come on," coaxed Sydney. "Let's go in." The dog turned and obediently followed her back inside. Which hotel room? Serena began to count, 2 floors down, 3 rooms over. She spun on her heel and went inside. Chapter 31. 40 minutes until midnight. The Three Crows Bar. Dominic took hold of Victor and Mitch and led them in silence and shadow out of the restrooms, through the bar, and into the alley that ran beside it. Victor gave a nod and Dominic let go, the world springing back into life around them. Even the deserted alley was a cacophony compared to the heavy quiet of the in-between. Victor rolled his shoulders and checked his watch. "That was weird," said Mitch, whose mood seemed to have soured considerably since being shot. "It was perfect," said Victor. "Let's go." "So, I passed?" asked Dominic, still flexing his hands. Victor could see the fear in his eyes, the desperate hope that the pain would stay away. He appreciated how transparent Dominic's desires were. It kept things simple. "The night's not over yet," he said, "but you're doing well so far." Mitch grumbled about the hole in his jacket as they made their way to the mouth of the alley. Victor knew that it was the first thing Mitch bought when they got out, a well-made coat, lined with dark-dyed goose down that now leaked in small puffs as he stepped off the curb. "Look at the bright side," said Victor. "You're alive." "Night's still young," said Mitch under his breath as they crossed the street. He said something else, or started to, but it was cut off by the sudden shriek of sirens. A squad car tore around a corner and down the street toward them, in red and blue and white and blaring ripples of noise. Mitch spun, and Victor tensed, and time slowed. And then, time stopped. Victor felt the hand come down on his arm, a breath before the sound and color went out of the night. A cop car froze, suspended between moments through the film of Dominic's shadows. Dominic's other hand rested on Mitch's wrist, and all 3 of them now stood in the darkness of his in-between world, frozen as if they, too, were caught in time. Victor might have admitted, if he could admit, if his words could take shape and sound, how useful Dominic Rusher was turning out to be, but since he couldn't, he simply nodded in the direction of the parking lot, and the 3 men waded through the thick air across the street. Victor knew they had a predicament. Dominic, while much improved, was in no condition to drag them across the city. They needed the car, but they couldn't use the car until they stepped out of the shadows, and the moment they did that, reality would resume and the squad car would continue down the street to the Three Crows. Victor led the way to the stolen sedan, the other 2 in a trailing line behind, and when they got there he gestured for them to kneel in the gap between their vehicle and the next on the side of the cops' car's frozen approach, which had before been a convertible and was now a considerably larger truck. He took one last breath and said a quiet curse, which was as close as Victor came to praying, and then he nodded at Dominic, whose hand vanished from his shoulder, stripping the stillness and plunging his world back into chaos. The cop car careened up to the bar's entrance, where it slammed to a stop, sirens blaring. Victor held his breath and pressed his body against the metal side of their sedan and peered through the narrow space between his front bumper and the truck's as the sirens cut abruptly off and left his ears ringing. 2 officers got out and met at the front doors. One cop vanished inside, but the other stayed on the curb and confirmed their arrival on a radio. Something about a body. They were here for Mitch's body, which was problematic, since there was no body, a fact that would soon become readily apparent. "Go inside," he begged the second cop. The cop didn't move. Victor freed his gun and trained it on the officer, tracking up until it was level with the man's head. He had a clear shot. He drew in a breath and held it. Victor didn't feel guilt or fear or even a sense of consequence, not like normal people. All those things had been dead, or at least dulled to the point of uselessness, for years. But he'd trained his mind to reconstruct those feelings from memory as best he could and assemble them into a kind of code. Nothing so elaborate as Eli's set of rules, just a simple wish to avoid killing bystanders if possible. It didn't feel wrong, resting his finger on the trigger, but his mind provided the word wrong. He lowered the gun a fraction, knowing that sacrificing a kill shot would also sacrifice the certitude of their escape. He let out his breath just as the radio crackled, and even if Victor couldn't make out the message, he could hear the officer's response. "What kind of problem?" And, a moment later, "What do you mean? According to Ever and Stell—" "Forget it, hold on." And just like that, the second cop turned toward the door. Victor lowered his weapon, and his eyes drifted skyward, where thick gray clouds weakened the black of the night. He'd never been one for God, never had Eli's zeal, never needed signs. But if there were such things, if there was fate, or some higher power, maybe it had an issue with Eli's methods too. The second officer followed the first inside, and Victor, Mitch, and Dominic were on their feet and in the car before the front doors of the bar had even swung shut. A yellow ticket flapped against the windshield, pinned beneath a wiper blade, and Victor leaned out the window, plucked it free, and crumpled it, dropping the paper to the ground. The wind instantly caught it, and the ticket bounced away. "Littering," said Mitch as Victor started the car. "Let's hope that's not the worst crime I commit tonight," said Victor as they pulled out of the lot, away from the Three Crows and the squad car, and back into the heart of the city as the minutes ticked away toward midnight. "Call Sydney. Make sure everything's okay on her end." An ambulance soared past them toward the bar. It wouldn't be necessary. "If I didn't know better," said Mitch, dialing, "I'd think you care." Chapter 32. 30 minutes until midnight. The Esquire Hotel. Burning the papers took longer than Sydney expected, and by the 7th or 8th page, the novelty of ruining something had faded, replaced by a tedious sense of obligation. She stood at the sink, boosted up by Victor's books, and fed one page at a time to the flame of the small blue lighter, waiting until each was a layer of ash in the sink before she began the next sheet, and strongly suspecting Victor had given her the task just to keep her busy. She didn't mind so much. It was better than sitting still, staring at the clock, and wondering when they'd be back. If they'd be back. Dahl stood beside her, nearly able to rest his nose on the counter by the remaining papers, and whimpering faintly every time she touched the lighter's flame to a page. She'd wait as long as she dared before dropping the burning paper into the sink, a little longer each time, and then watch as the crossed-out faces of Eli's victims blackened and curled, watch as the fire ate away their names, their dates, their lives. Sydney shivered. The room was freezing with the balcony doors open, and Dahl had already wandered out once, unsettled by the fire, but she had to leave them that way because of the smoke. It drifted out from the charred remains, and Sydney spent the whole task waiting for the alarms to go off. She had to resist the urge to burn the folder's remnants in one go and be done with it, but her concern about the alarms kept her slow, methodical. The amount of smoke created by a single page appeared too little to disrupt the systems, but lighting the whole folder at once would surely trigger something. Dahl soon lost interest and wandered out once more onto the balcony. Sydney didn't like him out there, and called him back, nearly singeing her fingers when she forgot to let go of the latest page. A phone rang in Sydney's pocket. Victor had bought it for her, or rather, Victor had bought it and then given it to Sydney after he saw what she could do. The phone was, in Sydney's eyes, an invitation to stay. She and Mitch and Victor all had the same models, and somehow that made Sydney happy. It was like belonging to a club. She wanted to belong to a club in school, but she'd never been great at sports, didn't care about student government. It was a joke in middle school anyway. And after resurrecting the science class's hamster, she was a bit shy about participating in the after-school nature club. High school clubs would be far more fun anyway, she reasoned. If she could stay alive that long. The phone rang again, and Sydney set the lighter aside and dug the device from her pocket.
Hello?
She answered.
Hey, Sid.
It was Mitch.
Everything okay there? I'm almost done with the papers,
she said, taking up the lighter and setting fire to another page. It was the blue-haired girl, the same blue almost as the lighter itself. Sydney watched as the girl's face curled into nothing.
Are you going to think up more ways to keep me busy?
Mitch laughed, but he didn't sound very happy.
You're a kid. Just watch some TV. We'll be home later. Hey, Mitch,
said Sydney softer.
You're coming back, right?
As soon as I can, Sid. Promise.
You better.
She lit another page.
Or I'll drink all your chocolate milk.
You wouldn't dare, said Mitch, and she could almost hear the smile in his voice before he hung up. Sydney put the phone away and lit the last page. It was hers. She touched the lighter to the corner and held the paper up so the fire ate its way along one side before swallowing the photo, the paper-thin version of the girl with the short blonde hair and water-blue eyes. It burned right through her, and then there was nothing. She let the fire lick her fingers before she dropped the page into the sink and smiled. That girl was dead. Someone knocked on the hotel door, and Sydney nearly dropped the lighter. The knocking came a second time. She held her breath. Dahl stood, made something like a growl, and put himself squarely between her and the hotel door. The knocking came a third time, and then someone spoke.
Sydney!
Even on her toes, Sydney wouldn't be able to see out of the peephole, but she didn't need to. She knew the voice, knew it better than her own. She lifted her hand and brought it over her mouth to stifle the surprise, the reply, the sound of breathing, as if she couldn't trust her lips with anything.
Sydney, please,
came Serena's voice through the door, smooth and soft and low. For a moment, Sydney almost forgot, the hotel and the shooting at the Broken Lake, and it was like they were home and playing hide-and-seek, and Sydney was too good and Serena had given up, or gotten bored, and was imploring her little sister to give up, too, to come out. If they'd been at home, Serena would have said she had cookies or lemonade. Or why didn't they go watch that movie Sydney had been wanting to see? They could make popcorn. None of it was true, of course, even then. Serena would say anything to coax her little sister out, and Sydney wouldn't mind, not really, because she'd won. But they weren't at home. They weren't anywhere near home. And this game was rigged, because her sister didn't have to lie or bribe or cheat. All she had to do was say the words.
Sydney, come open the door.
She put aside the lighter and stepped down from Victor's book, and crossed the room, pressing her hand against the wood for a moment before her traitorous fingers drifted over to the doorknob, and turned. Serena stood in the doorway wearing a green pea coat and a pair of leggings that vanished into heeled black boots. Her hands were braced against the frame to either side. One hand was empty, and the other held a gun. The hand with the gun slid down the door frame with a metallic hiss, before coming to rest at her side. Sydney cringed away from the weapon.
Hello, Sydney,
she said as she tapped the gun absently against her leggings.
Hello, Serena,
said her sister.
Don't run,
said Serena. It never occurred to Sydney to do so. She couldn't tell, though, if she thought she had been there and bled away at her sister's words, or if she was brave enough to have never considered running, or if she was simply smart enough to know she couldn't outrun bullets twice, especially without a forest and a head start. Whatever the reason, Sydney stayed very, very still. Dahl growled as Serena stepped into the hotel room, but when she told him to sit, he did, back legs folding reluctantly. Serena strode past her little sister, surveying the ashes in the sink and the carton of chocolate milk on the counter. Sydney had silently resolved to drink it, at least some of it, if Mitch didn't come back soon, before turning back to Sydney.
Do you have a phone?
She asked. Sydney nodded, her hand drifting of its own accord to her pocket and retrieving the one Victor had given her. The one that matched his and Mitch's. The one that made them a team. Serena held out her hand, and Sydney's hand held out itself, depositing the device into her sister's palm. Serena then walked to the balcony where the doors were still open to vent the smoke, and lobbed the phone over the railing and into the night. Sydney's heart sank with the rectangle of falling metal. She really liked that phone. Serena then shut the balcony doors and perched on the back of the couch facing her sister, her gun resting on her knee. She sat the way Sydney did, or rather, Sydney sat the way she always had, with only half her weight, as if she might need to dash up at any second. But where Sydney's perching looked coiled, Serena somehow made the act look casual, even lazy, despite the weapon. "Happy birthday," she said. "It's not midnight yet," said Sydney quietly. "You can come up and stay through your birthday," Serena had promised. Now she smiled sadly. "You used to stay up until the clock turned, even though Mom told you not to because she knew you'd be tired the next day. You'd sit awake and read and wait, and when the clock struck midnight, you'd light a candle you'd stashed under the bed and make a wish." There was a coat draped on the back of the couch, the red one Sydney had thrown off after Victor told her she had to stay behind, and now Serena fiddled with one of the buttons. "It was like this secret birthday party," she added softly, "just for you, before everyone else could join in and celebrate." "How did you know?" asked Sydney. "I'm your big sister," said Serena. "It's my job to know things." "Then tell me," said Sydney. "Why do you hate me?" Serena held her gaze. "I don't. But you want me to die. You think I'm somehow wrong, broken." "I think we're all broken," said Serena, tossing her the red coat. "Put that on." "I don't feel broken," Sydney said quietly as she tugged on the two big sleeves. "And even if I am, I can fix other people." Serena considered her sister. "You can't fix the dead, Sid. EOs are proof of that. And besides, it's not your place to try." "It's not your place to control people's lives," snapped Sydney. Serena raised a brow, amused. "Who taught you to sing so loud? The little Sydney I knew could barely chirp." "I'm not that Sydney anymore." Serena's face fell. Her grip tightened on the gun. "We're going for a walk," she said. Sydney cast glances around the room, even as her feet followed Serena toward the door with the same simple obedience that had possessed her hands to offer up the phone. Treacherous limbs. She wanted to leave a note, a clue, something, but Serena got impatient and grabbed her sleeve, shoving her toward the hall. Doll sat in the middle of the room, whining as they passed. "Can I bring him?" Serena paused and ejected the magazine of the gun to check the number of rounds. "Okay," she said, snapping it shut again. "Where's his leash?" "He doesn't have one." Serena held open the door and sighed. "Follow Sydney," she said to Doll, and the dog sprang to his feet and loped over, pressing himself against the girl's side. Serena led Sydney and Doll down the concrete stairs that ran beside the elevator, all the way to the parking garage, an open-walled structure pressed against the Esquire's spine. The place smelled like gas, the light was dim, and the air was biting cold, the sideways wind ripping through in short, sharp gusts. "Are we driving somewhere?" asked Sydney, pulling the coat close around her. "No," said Serena, turning on her sister. She brought the gun up to Sydney's forehead, rested it against her skin, between her watery blue eyes. Doll growled. Sydney brought a hand up and rested it against his back to quiet him, but didn't take her gaze off Serena, even though it was a struggle to focus her vision around the barrel of the gun. "We used to have the same eyes," said Serena. "Yours are paler now." "I like that we're finally different," said Sydney, fighting back a shiver. "I don't want to be you." Silence fell between the sisters, a silence full of shifting pieces. "I don't need you to be me," said Serena at last. "But I need you to be brave. I need you to be strong." Sydney squeezed her eyes shut. "I'm not afraid." Serena stood in the garage with her finger on the trigger, the barrel resting between Sydney's eyes, and froze. The girl on the other side of the gun was and was not her sister. Maybe Eli was wrong, and all EOs weren't broken, at least not in the same way. Or maybe Eli was right and the Sydney she knew was gone. But still, this new Sydney wasn't hollowed out, wasn't dark, wasn't truly dead. This Sydney was alive in a way the other had never been. It shone through her skin. Serena's fingers loosened on the gun, and she let it slide from her sister's face. Sydney kept her eyes squeezed shut. The gun had left a mark on her forehead, a small dent where she'd leaned into the weapon, and Serena reached out and smoothed it away with her thumb. Only then did Sydney's eyes drift open, the strength in them wavering.
"Why?"
she started.
"I need you to listen now,"
cut in Serena in her even tone, the one that no one, not even Eli, knew how to refuse. An absolute power.
"I need you to do as I say."
She pressed the gun into Sydney's hands, and then took her by the shoulders and squeezed.
"Go,"
she said.
"Where?"
said Sydney.
"Somewhere safe."
Serena let go and gave her sister a small push backward, away, a gesture that once might have been playful, normal. But the look in her eyes and the gun in Sydney's hands and the cold night hardening around them served as a vivid reminder that nothing was normal now. Sydney tucked the gun into her coat, but didn't take her eyes from her sister, and didn't move. "Go!" snapped Serena. This time, Sydney did as she was told. She turned, clutched the scruff of Dahl's neck, and the two bolted between the cars. Serena watched until her sister was a speck of red, and then nothing. At least, she'd have a chance. A phone rang in the pocket of Serena's coat. She rubbed her eyes and answered. "I'm here," said Eli. "Where are you?" Serena straightened.
"I'm on my way."
Chapter 33. 20 minutes until midnight. The Falcon Price Project. Sydney ran. She cut through the Esquire's parking garage and onto a side street that looped back around to the front of the hotel and ended up a few yards to the left of the main doors. A cop stood several feet away, his back to her as he sipped a coffee and talked on his cell. Sydney felt the weight of the gun in her pocket, as if the hidden firearm would draw more attention than a missing girl in a bright red coat clutching the collar of a giant black dog. But the cop never turned around. It was late, and the cars on the main road were sparse, the traffic clumping as the night wore on, and Sydney and Dahl sprinted across the street, unnoticed. Sydney knew exactly where she was going. Serena had told Sydney to go home. She hadn't told her to run away. She told her to go somewhere safe, and over the course of the last week, safe had ceased to be a place for Sydney and had become a person. Specifically, safe had become Victor. Which is why Sydney ran to the only place she knew Victor would be, at least according to the profile he'd had her put up on the police database that night, the one she'd read through a dozen times while waiting and then working up the nerve to hit the post button. The Falcon Price high-rise project. Down the block, the construction site was a spot of dark in the city, like a shadow between streetlights. There was a thin shell of wood surrounding the abandoned high-rise, 2-story walls, the kind people loved to vandalize because they were both temporary and highly visible. The shell was plastered with posters and signs, tagged here and there by street art, and underneath it all, a few construction permits and a building company logo. Officially, there was only one way onto the construction site, through a front gate, also made of wooden sheeting, which had spent the last few months chained shut. But earlier that day, when Mitch had brought her to revive Officer Dane, he'd shown her another way in, not through the chained-off gate, but around the back of the building, through a place in the shell where 2 broad panels of wood overlapped slightly. He'd widened the gap between the sheets to let them through, the panels snapping shut again behind them. Sydney knew she could squeeze into the construction site without touching the walls, since even when the panels hung closed, there was a small triangle of space near the bottom. She let go of Dahl's neck and worried the dog would bolt, but he didn't, only stood there watching Sydney crawl through the gap. Dahl looked both distressed by Sydney's decision and determined to follow her. When she made it to the other side and stood, brushing dirt from her pants, the dog crouched down and squirmed through the gap in the boards. "Good dog," she whispered as he stood and shook off. Inside the wooden shell was a kind of yard, a large stretch of dirt strewn with bits of metal and plywood and bags of concrete. The yard was dark, shadows on shadows, making the path from the wall to the building dangerous. The building itself towered, unfinished, a steel and concrete skeleton draped in layers of plastic sheeting like gauze. But on the ground floor, several layers of plastic in, Sydney could make out a light. It was diffused so much that if the yard hadn't been so dark, she might not notice. But she did. Dahl pressed himself against her side. Sydney stood in the yard, unsure of what to do. Was Victor here already? It wasn't midnight yet, was it? She didn't have her phone, couldn't tell by the moon if she even knew how to read the moon, because there was no moon above, only a thick layer of clouds, glowing faintly with reflected city light. As for the light within the high-rise, it was steady, constant, more like a lamp than a flashlight, and somehow that gave Sydney comfort. Someone had set it there, had prepared, had planned. Victor planned things, but when she took a step toward the building, Dahl barred her path. When she went around him, his jaws circled her forearm and held fast. She twisted but couldn't get free, and even though the dog was careful not to bite down, his grip was solid. "Let go," she hissed. The dog didn't budge. And then, on the other side of the building, beyond the thin wood shell, a car door slammed. Dahl dropped Sydney's arm as his head snapped toward the sound. The noise, sharp and metallic, reminded Sydney of a gunshot and sent her pulse spiking. The word, safe, 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 pounding with the blood in her ears. She sprinted for the building, for the sheets and the steel and the shelter, tripping over a stray iron bar before reaching the hollow high-rise frame. Dahl followed, and the two vanished into the Falcon Price as somewhere, on the opposite side, someone dragged the front gate open. Mitch slammed the car door and watched Victor and Dominic drive away. He'd planned to circle around to the back of the high-rise, pry open the loose wooden panel, and get in that way, but when he stepped up to the front gate, he saw it wasn't necessary. The chains had been cut, the snaking metal coiled on the ground at his feet. Someone was already inside. "Great," whispered Mitch, withdrawing the gun Victor had given him. Incidentally, Mitch had always hated guns, and the events of the evening hadn't made him any fonder. He pushed open the gate, wincing as the hinges, screwed into the wood, responded with a metallic whine. The yard was dark and, as far as he could tell, empty. He ejected the magazine on the gun, checked it, put it back, and wrapped the barrel of the weapon nervously against his palm as he made his way to the center of the yard, halfway between the wooden shell of the fence and the steel skeleton of the high-rise, to a patch of dirt that was as open as possible. A faint glow coming from the high-rise did little to illuminate him, but given his size and the sheer lack of other people, Mitch felt painfully confident he would be noticed, and soon. A stack of wooden beams, tarped against the weather, sat a few feet away, and Mitch sank onto them, checked his gun a second time, and waited. Serena's phone rang again as she crossed the street, making her way down the now nearly deserted block toward the Falcon Price high-rise. "Serena," said the caller. It wasn't Eli's voice. "Detective Stell," she replied. She could hear the open and close of a car door. "We're on our way now," he said. The line was muffled for a moment while the phone speaker was covered and orders were given. "Remember," she said, "you're to stay outside the fence." "I know the orders," he said. "That's not why I called." Serena saw the signage of the abandoned high-rise and slowed her pace. "Then what is it?" "Mr. Ever had me send officers to a bar to clean up after an incident. There was supposed to be a body." "Yeah, Mitchell Turner's," she said. "Only I get a call from the officers just now. There was no body, no signs of a body either." Serena's boots slowed and stopped. "I don't know what's going on," said Stell, "but that's the second time things haven't lined up and—" "And you didn't call Eli?" She cut in softly. "I'm sorry if that was wrong." "Why did you call me instead?" "I trust you," he answered without hesitation. "And Eli?" "I trust you," he said again, and Serena's heart fluttered a little, both at the officer's small display of evasion, the defiance of it, and at her own control over him. She started walking again. "You did well," she said as she reached the wooden walls of the construction site. And there, through the gap in the broken gate, she saw Mitch's hulking form. "I'll take care of it," she whispered. "Trust me." "I do," said Detective Stell. Serena hung up and pushed the metal gate open. Chapter 34. 10 minutes until midnight. The Falcon Price Project. Mitch thought he heard something from the building behind him, but when he strained to listen, the sounds that made it into the yard were so broken and faint that they could have been wind through the plastic sheeting or a loose pipe. He might have gone to see, but Victor's orders had been explicit, and even if he felt like challenging them, it was at that moment that the front gate that surrounded the bones of the high-rise groaned inward again, and a girl stepped into the yard. She looked like Sydney, thought Mitch, if Sydney had grown a foot taller and several years older. The same blonde hair curled down into eyes that were somehow bright and blue, even in the dark. It had to be Serena. When she saw Mitch waiting, she crossed her arms. "Mr. Turner," she said, stepping forward, her black boots weaving effortlessly through the debris of the construction yard. "You have an impressive resilience to death. Is this Sydney's work?" "Call me a cat," said Mitch, pushing up off the planks. "I'm still working through my own 9 lives. And just so you know," he added, raising his gun, "I like to think there's a special place in hell for girls who feed their little sisters to wolves." Serena's face fell. "You should be careful playing with guns," she said. "Sooner or later, you're going to get shot." Mitch cocked the gun. "The novelty wore off when your boyfriend played target practice with my chest." "Yet here you are," said Serena. Her voice had a slow, almost lazy sweetness to it. "Clearly his message wasn't impactful enough." Mitch tightened his grip on the gun and leveled it at her. Serena only smiled. "Let's point that in a safer direction," she said. "Place the gun against your temple." Mitch did everything he could to keep his hand still, but it was as if it no longer belonged to him. His elbow softened, his arm bent, and his fingers turned, shifting position until the barrel of the gun came to rest against the side of his head. He swallowed. "There are worse ways to die," said Serena, "and worse things to do than die. I promise, I'll make it quick." Mitch looked at her, this girl so much like Sydney, and yet so much less. He couldn't look at her eyes, at once brighter than her sister's, but empty in a bad way, a dead way. So he watched her lips as they formed the words. "Pull the trigger." And he did. Sydney and Doll were halfway toward the glowing center of the high-rise's ground floor when she heard the sound of footsteps, not hers or the dog's, but heavier, and froze in her tracks. She'd only been with Victor and Mitch a few days, but it had been long enough to grow familiar with the sounds they both made. Not just their voices, but the way they sounded when they weren't speaking, the way they breathed and laughed and moved, the way they filled a space and traveled through it. Mitch was huge, but his steps were careful, as if he knew his size and didn't want to accidentally crush anything. Victor was almost silent, footfalls as smooth and hushed as everything else about him. The steps Sydney heard now through several layers of plastic sheeting were louder, the proud clip of nice shoes. Eli had worn nice shoes. Despite the cold and the fact that he was dating a college girl, and the fact that he looked like a college boy, he'd had on leather shoes beneath his jeans when she met him, shoes that made a sharp sound when he walked. Sydney held her breath and slid Serena's gun from her coat pocket, clicking the safety off. Serena had showed her once how to use a gun, but this one was a little too big for her grip, too heavy, and ill-weighted from the silencer screwed onto the end. She looked behind her and wondered if she could find her way back through the maze of plastic curtains and into the lot before Eli would. Her thoughts trailed off as she realized that the footsteps had stopped. She checked the curtains to every side for moving shadows, but there were none, so she crept forward, through another plastic sheet, the light brighter here. Only a few curtains between her and the source. Victor should be here by now. She couldn't hear him, but that was because he was so quiet, she told herself. He was always quiet, and safe. "Sydney, look at me," he'd said. "No one is going to hurt you. Do you know why? Because I'll hurt them first." Safe. 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 She pulled aside the last curtain. She just had to find Victor, and he would keep her safe. Eli was sitting in a chair in the middle of the room, a table made of wooden planks on cinder blocks displaying what looked like a set of kitchen knives, all gleaming beneath the light of a lamp. The lamp had no shade, and the bulb lit the whole room from curtain to curtain, and Eli in between. A gun dangled loosely from his hand, and his eyes were far off, unfocused. Until he saw Sydney. "What's this?" he asked, standing. "A little monster." Sydney didn't wait. She raised Serena's gun and fired once at Eli's face. The weapon was heavy and her aim was off, but even though the blowback knocked the gun from her grip, the bullet still found Eli's jaw and sent him reeling, clutching his face, blood and bone between his fingers. She spun and tried to run away, but his hand shot out and caught her sleeve, and even though he couldn't keep hold, the sudden change of course sent her stumbling to her hands and knees on the concrete. Dahl lunged forward as Sydney rolled onto her back, and Eli straightened, jaw crackling and snapping and healing, leaving only a smear of blood on his skin as he raised his gun and pulled the trigger. Click. One small sound after Mitch pulled the trigger. The sound made by the internal spring driving the firing pin to bypass the bullet and hit the mechanical stop. Because there were no bullets. The gun was empty. Mitch should know. He checked it 3 times to make sure. Now he watched the surprise spread across Serena's face, watched it turn to confusion, and begin to shift into something harder, but it never made it there, because that's when the darkness parted. The shadows behind Serena Clark stirred and drew apart, and 2 men stepped into being out of nothing. Dominic stood, holding a red gas canister while Victor took a single stride up behind Serena, brought the knife to her throat, and drew it cleanly across. There was a blossom of red, and her lips parted, but he'd cut deep, and no sound made it out. "And Ulysses stopped up his ears against the siren's song," recited Victor, pulling the plugs from his own ears as Serena collapsed to the dirt lot. "For it was death." "Jesus," said Dominic, looking away. "She was just a girl." Victor looked down at her body. Blood was pooling beneath Serena's face, glistening and dark. "Don't be insulting," he said. "She was the most powerful woman in the city, aside from Sydney, of course." "About Sydney," said Mitch, looking down at the dead girl. From this angle she seemed smaller, and with her face turned like that, her hair caught in the collar of her coat, the resemblance was disturbing. "What are we going to do about this?" Dominic set the plastic gas tank on the dirt beside the body. "Burn the body," said Victor, closing his knife. "I don't want Sydney seeing it, and I certainly don't want her getting her hands on it. The last thing we need is Serena coming back to life." Mitch had just taken up the gas canister when a gun fired within the building, lighting up the bones of the high-rise like a camera flash. "What the hell?" growled Victor. "Looks like Eli got here first," said Mitch. "But if I'm out here," said Victor, "then what's Eli shooting at?" He grabbed hold of Dominic's shoulder. "Take me in there, now!" The sound of Eli's gun rang off the concrete as Dahl's body buckled, and even though he didn't seem to feel the pain of the shot, he fell onto his side, panting for air. His chest went up and down, and then stopped. Eli saw the girl reach for the dog, but he recocked the gun and leveled it on her. "Goodbye, Sydney," he said. And then the darkness moved around her, and a pair of hands reached out of nothing and jerked her backward into nothing with them. Eli pulled the trigger and the bullet hit the plastic sheeting where the girl had been. He let out a frustrated sound and fired 2 more shots into the space that had been Sydney, but she was gone. Chapter 35. Midnight. The Falcon Price Project. Sydney felt someone take hold and pull her into the dark. One moment she was looking down the barrel of Eli's gun, and the next she was standing hand in hand with the man from the profile she'd given Victor. She looked around, but didn't let go. They were still in the plastic-sheeted room, and yet they weren't. It was like standing outside of life, stuck in a too-still world that scared her more than she would ever admit. She could see Eli, the bullet from his gun hovering in the air where she had been, and Dahl, lifeless on the ground. And Victor. He hadn't been there a moment before, but now he was, standing several feet behind Eli, unseen, one hand reaching slightly forward and out, as if about to rest on Eli's shoulder. Sydney tried to tell the man holding her hand that she had to get Dahl, but her lips made no sound, and he didn't even look at her, only dragged her through the heavy world, winding back through the curtains of plastic until they reached the place where the building gave way to the dirt lot. There was a bright light across the lot, casting shadows up against the metal bones of the high-rise, but the man pulled her in the other direction, leading her to a darkened corner in the back of the construction site. They stepped back into the world, the bubble of quiet bursting into life and sound around them. Even just the sound of breathing, of time passing, was deafening compared to the quiet of the shadows. "You have to go back," snapped Sydney, kneeling in the dirt. "Can't. Victor's orders." "But you have to get Doll." "Sydney. It's Sydney, right?" The man knelt in front of her. "I saw the dog, okay? I'm sorry. It was too late." She held his eyes the way Serena had held hers, calm and cold and unblinking. She knew she didn't have her sister's gift, her control, but even before Serena got her way, and she was Serena's sister, and she needed him to see. "Go back," she said sternly. "Go! Get Doll!" And it must have worked, because Dominic swallowed, nodded, and vanished into nothing. Eli emptied the gun into the air, but all signs of them were gone. He growled and ejected the magazine. It clattered to the ground as he dug in his coat for a full one. "I watch you, and it's like watching two people." He spun at the sound of the voice and found Victor leaning back against a concrete pillar. Victor didn't hesitate. He fired 3 times into Eli's chest, mimicking the pattern of the scars on his own body, the way he had imagined he would for the last 10 years. And it felt good. He had been worried that after so much waiting and so much wanting, the actuality of shooting Eli wouldn't live up to the dream, but it did. The air buzzed around them, and Eli groaned and braced himself against the chair as the pain multiplied. "It's why I let you stay," said Victor. "Why I liked you. All that charm outside, all that evil inside. There was a monster under there long before you died." "I'm not a monster," growled Eli as he dug one of the bullets out of his shoulder and dropped the bloodied metal to the floor. "I am God's." But Victor was already there, burying a switchblade in Eli's chest. He punctured a lung, he could tell by the gasp. Victor's mouth twitched, face patient but knuckles white around the blade's grip. "Enough," said Victor. Behind his eyes, the dial turned up. Eli screamed. "You aren't some avenging angel, Eli," he said. "You're not blessed or divine or burdened. You're a science experiment." Victor pulled the knife out. Eli went down on one knee. "You don't understand," gasped Eli. "No one understands." "When no one understands, that's usually a good sign that you're wrong." Eli struggled up to his knees, reaching for the makeshift table as his skin knit together. Victor's gaze shifted to it, taking in the row of knives, just like that day. "How nostalgic of you." He put a foot on the table and knocked it over, sending the weapon scattering across the concrete. The dog's body, he noticed, was gone. "You can't kill me, Victor," said Eli. "You know that." Victor's smile widened as he buried his knife between Eli's ribs. "I know," he said loudly. He had to speak up over the screams. "But you'll have to indulge me. I've waited so long to try." A breath later, Dominic reappeared, half carrying, half dragging a very large, very dead dog. He sank to the dirt lot beside its body, breathing heavily. Sydney hurried over, thanked him, and then asked him to get out of her way. Dominic sagged back and watched as she ran a soothing hand over the dog's side, brushing the wound lightly. Her palm came away dark red, and she frowned. "I told you," he said. "I'm sorry." "Shh," she said, and pressed her hands, fingers splayed, against the dog's chest. She drew in a shaky breath as the cold flooded up her arms. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, doll." But nothing happened. Her heart sank. Sidney Clark gave second chances, but the dog had already had his. She'd fixed him once, but she didn't know she could do it again. She pressed down harder and felt the cold leaching something from her. The dog still lay dead and stiff as the planks in the construction lot. She shivered and knew it shouldn't be this hard as she reached not with her hands, but something else, as if she could find a spark of heat within and take hold. She reached past the fur and skin and stiffness as her hands hurt and her lungs tightened, and still she kept reaching. And then she felt it and took hold, and between one moment and the next, the dog's body softened, slackened. Its limbs twitched and its chest rose once, paused, fell, and a moment later rose again before the beast stretched and sat up. Dominic scrambled to his feet. "Dios mío," he whispered, crossing himself. Sydney sat, gasping for breath, and rested her head against Doll's muzzle. "Good dog." Victor smiled. He was having a fabulous time killing Eli. Every time he thought his friend had given up, he pulled himself back together and gave Victor the chance to try again. He wished it could go on a while longer, but at last he was quite certain, as Eli's body buckled in pain, that he had his full attention. Eli gasped and staggered to his feet, nearly slipping on the blood. The floor was slick with it. Most of it was Eli's, Victor knew, but not all. Blood ran down one of Victor's arms and over his stomach, both shallow cuts made by a wicked-looking kitchen knife Eli had managed to recover from the floor the last time Victor shot him. The guns were both empty now, and the two men stood, bleeding, across from one another, each armed, Eli with a serrated knife, and Victor with a switchblade. "This is a waste," said Eli, adjusting his grip. "You can't win." Victor took a deep breath, wincing faintly. He'd had to turn his own threshold down because he couldn't afford to bleed out, not yet, and certainly not without noticing. He could hear the distant sirens of the cop cars. They were running out of time. He lunged for Eli and managed to skim his shirt before Eli knocked the blow away and drove his own blade down into Victor's leg. He hissed as his knee buckled beneath him. "What was your plan?" chided Eli, reaching out not for Victor but for the chair, for something coiled on it, something Victor hadn't noticed until Eli's hands took hold of it. "You hear the cops coming? They're all on my side here. No one's coming to save you." "That's the idea," coughed Victor as his eyes focused on the thing in Eli's hand. Metal wire, razor sharp. "You and your ideas," hissed Eli. "Well, I've been planning too." Victor tried to find his feet, but he was too slow. Eli looped the wire in the air and brought it down around Victor's wrist, the one with the knife, pulling hard. The wire dug in, slicing through skin and drawing blood, forcing Victor to drop the blade, which clattered to the concrete. Eli caught his free hand in a crushing grip and wound the wire around that one too. Victor pulled back, but the cord only bit deeper into his skin. The wire, he noticed then, was threaded through the chair itself, which Eli must have fastened to the ground because it never moved, not during the fight, and not now when Eli yanked his end of the cord and the slack drew in, forcing Victor's hands toward the bars in the back of the chair. Blood ran down his wrist too fast. His head was beginning to spin. He could hear the sirens now, loud and clear, and thought that he could even see the red and blue of the police lights through the plastic curtains. Color danced before his eyes. He smiled grimly and shut off the last of the pain. "You'll never kill me, Eli," he goaded. "That's where you're wrong, Victor. And this time," he said, cinching the wire, "I'm gonna watch the life bleed out of your eyes." Mitch watched Serena's body burn and tried not to listen to the sounds of gunfire coming from inside the high-rise. He had to trust Victor. Victor always had a plan. But where was he, and where was Dominic? He refocused on the body and the task at hand until red and blue lights began to flash beyond the wood walls, colors cast up against the darkened building. That wasn't good. The cops weren't in the yard yet, but it was only a matter of minutes before they swarmed the place. Mitch couldn't risk the broken gate of the front entrance, so he rounded the building toward the gap in the walls, only to find Sydney leaning over a half-dead doll and Dominic standing over both, praying silently. "Sydney Clark," he snapped. "What the hell are you doing here?" "She told me I had to go somewhere safe," whispered Sydney, petting Doll. She, thought Mitch. The same she, he guessed, that was burning on the other side of the building. "And you came here?" "The dog was dead," whispered Dominic. I saw it. It was deader than dead, and now—" Mitch took Dominic's sleeve. "Get us out of here, now!" Dominic's eyes drifted up from the girl and the dog and seemed to register the flashing lights bouncing over the wooden walls and up against the high-rise for the first time. Car doors were slamming, boots on pavement. "Shit!" "Yeah, exactly." "What about Victor?" asked Sydney. "We have to wait for him somewhere. Not here, Sid. We were never supposed to wait here." "But what if he needs help?" she protested. Mitch tried to smile. "It's Victor," he said. "There's nothing he can't handle." But as Sydney took Doll and Dominic took Sydney and Mitch took Dominic, and they all vanished into the shadows. Mitch had a horrible feeling that he was wrong, and his curse had followed him, all the way here. Eli heard footsteps, the men shouting orders as they tore toward them, through room after room of the plastic sheeting. Victor slumped on the floor, the area around the chair slick with his blood. His eyes were open, but losing focus. Eli wanted this kill to be his, not the Merritt Police Department's, and certainly not Serena's. His. He saw Victor's knife on the floor a few feet away, and took it up, crouching in front of him.
"Some hero,"
he heard Victor whisper with his last 2 labored breaths. Eli rested the blade carefully beneath Victor's ribs. "Goodbye, Victor," he said, and then drove the knife in. Dominic buckled. He went down on his hands and knees in an alley 4 blocks from the high-rise, a safe distance from the flood of cops and the burning girl and the guns. He cried out, and at the same time Sidney clutched her arm, and Mitch rubbed his bruised ribs. Pain swept over the 3 like a current, like a breath, something held back and now returned. And then, one by one, they realized what that meant. "No!" shouted Sidney, turning back toward the high-rise. Mitch caught her around the waist, wincing as she kicked and screamed, and told him to put her down.
"It's over,"
he whispered as she fought.
"It's over. It's over. I'm sorry. It's over."
Eli watched Victor's eyes widen, and then empty, his forehead slumping forward against the metal bars of the chair. Dead. It was so strange that Eli, of all people, had thought Victor was invincible. And he'd been wrong. Eli drew the knife out of Victor's chest and stood there in the blood-slicked room, waiting for the telltale quiet, the moment of peace. He closed his eyes and tipped his head back, and waited. And he was still waiting when the cops tore into the room, led by Detective Stell. "Step away from the body," ordered Stell, raising his gun. "It's okay," said Eli. He opened his eyes and let his gaze drift down over them. "It's over." "Get your hands on your head," shouted another cop. "Put the knife down," ordered another. "It's okay," said Eli again. "He's no danger now." "Hands up," demanded Stell. "I took care of him. He's dead." Eli grew indignant as he gestured to the blood-soaked room and the dead man bound by wire to the chair bars. "Can't you see that? I'm a hero." The men leveled their guns and shouted and looked at Eli as if he were a monster. And then it hit him. There was no glaze in their eyes. No spell. "Where's Serena?" he demanded, but the question was swallowed up by the sirens and the shouting cops. "Where is she? She'll tell you." "Put the weapon down," demanded Stell above the noise. "She'll tell you. I'm a hero," he shouted back, throwing the knife aside. "I saved you all." But as the blade hit the floor, the cops rushed forward and slammed him to the ground. He could see Victor's dead face from there, and it seemed to be smiling at him. "Eli Ever, you're under arrest for the murder of Victor Vale." "Wait!" he shouted as they cuffed him. "The body!" Stell read him his rights as 2 cops wrenched him to his feet. Another cop hurried to Stell's side and said something about a fire out in the lot. Eli fought their grip. "You have to burn the body!" Stell gave a signal and the cops dragged Eli back through the plastic curtains. "Stell!" shouted Eli again. "You have to burn Vale's body!" His words echoed on the concrete as the detective and the blood-soaked room and Victor's corpse vanished from his view. Chapter 36. 2 nights later, Merritt Cemetery. Sidney readjusted the shovel on her shoulder. The air was cold, but the night was clear, and the moon overhead illuminated the broken gravestones and the dips in the grass as she wove through the cemetery, Doll trotting along beside her. It had been harder to bring him back the second time, but he flanked her now as if his life were truly tied to hers. Mitch followed close behind, carrying 2 more shovels. He had offered to carry hers too, but Sidney felt it was important she hold her own. Dominic lagged several yards behind them, buzzed on painkillers and whiskey and tripping every few steps on a clump of weeds or a bit of dislodged rock. She didn't like him this way, useless from all the liquor and mean from all the pain, but she tried not to think of that. She tried not to think of her own pain either, of the gunshot still burning a hole in her arm as the muscle and skin slowly healed. She hoped it left a scar, the kind she could see, the kind that would remind her of the moment when everything changed. Not that Sydney thought she'd ever forget. She readjusted the shovel on her shoulder and wondered if Eli would live forever, and how much of forever someone could reasonably remember, especially when nothing left a mark. Eli, incidentally, had been a press field day. She and Mitch had seen it on the news, the madman who'd murdered 2 people at the Falcon Price building, all the while claiming to be some monster slayer, some hero. The press said he'd killed a young woman in the construction lot and burned her body before torturing and then murdering an ex-con on the ground floor. The woman's identity hadn't been made public. They'd have to go by dental records. But Sydney knew it was Serena. She knew even before she made Mitch hack the coroner's reports. She could feel the absence of her sister, the place in her where the threads had been. What she didn't know was why Eli would have done it, but she meant to find out. The members of the press weren't nearly as interested in Serena as they were in Eli. Apparently, Eli had stood there over Victor's body, covered in blood, still holding the knife, and shouting that he was a hero, that he'd saved them all. When no one bought the hero line, he tried to claim it had been a fight, but since his opponent was shredded and he didn't have a scratch on him, that line hadn't worked so well either. Add that to the papers found in the satchel in Eli's hotel room. He clearly didn't have Victor's foresight to burn anything that could be construed as evidence, and the profiles on his computer, and Eli's body count quickly jumped into double digits. The news never touched on the Merritt Police Department's own involvement in a good number of the recent killings, but Eli was now awaiting trial and a psych evaluation. There was no mention of him being an EO, of course, but then again, why would there be? All it meant for Eli was that if someone shanked him in prison, he'd live to have it happen again. If he were lucky, they'd put him in isolation like Victor. Sydney hoped they didn't put him in isolation. She thought that maybe, if they found out he could heal himself, hurting him would become the most popular game in the facility. Sydney made a mental note to leak that detail wherever he ended up. It was too quiet in the cemetery, what with only the sounds of grass-muffled steps in the dark, so Sydney tried to hum the way Victor had when they'd gone to dig up Barry. But it sounded wrong in her mouth, eerie and sad, so she stopped and focused on finding her way by the map drawn in Sharpie on the back of her hand. She'd drawn it in daylight, but the Merritt Cemetery, like most things, looked different at night. Finally, she caught sight of the fresh grave and quickened her pace. The grave was unmarked, except for Victor's book, which Sydney had set like a stone at the top of the patch of dirt that morning, waiting in the shadow of a stone angel for the diggers to finish and go away. That detective, Stell, had been there too. He'd stayed long enough to watch the simple wood coffin get lowered down into the hole and covered with dirt. Mitch caught up to her, and the two looked down at the grave for a moment before Sydney drove her shovel into the ground and set to work. Dahl wandered the plots nearby, but never let Sydney out of his sight, and Dominic eventually wandered over and sat on a gravestone, keeping an eye out for trouble as the other two dug. Thud, thud, thud. They drove their shovels in the ground until the air seemed warmer and the night seemed thinner, and light grazed the far edges of the sky where it met the buildings of Merritt. Some time before dawn, Sydney's shovel hit wood, and they scraped the last dirt from the top of the coffin and heaved the lid up. Sydney looked down at Victor's body. Then she perched on the edge of the coffin and pressed her hands against his chest, reaching as far as she could. A moment later, the cold ran up her arms and caught her breath, and beneath her hands a heartbeat fluttered, as Victor Vale opened his eyes and smiled. This has been an Audible Inc. production of Vicious, written by Victoria Schwab, narrated by Noah Michael Levine. Producer, Mike Charzuk. Copyright 2013 by Victoria Schwab. Production copyright 2013 by Audible Inc.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.